In an attempt to blunt the efforts of Antony's diplomacy, Octavian decided that it was high time he took a wife, and arranged a marriage with the widowed Scribonia. She was a much older woman, and seemed a poor match, until you consider that she was also Sextus Pompey's aunt-in-law. In the highly familial world of Roman politics, Octavian was signaling his own willingness to ally with Sextus. At the very least, he hoped to make the young admiral think twice before taking sides against his new uncle. Antony and his fleet arrived in Brundisium and found the city locked up tight by Octavian's garrison. A siege began, and Octavian hurried down with his armies to assess the situation. Was this the beginning of the end of the triumvirate? In an interesting turn of events, the answer turned out to be an emphatic no. Centurions in both camps had had enough of civil war. They had had enough of killing each other. They were friends, neighbors, comrades, in some cases family. Enough was enough. You know the old saying, what if they threw a war and no one showed up? At Brundisium, that's exactly what happened. The centurions went to their respective commanders and said, look, you do what you want, but we're not going to battle. We would suggest coming to some kind of an agreement, because the only way this is going to end now if you both refuse to compromise is some kind of single combat gladiatorial death match for control of the empire. Which is fine, we'll cheer you on, but we're not doing your fighting for you anymore. Left mutually defenseless, Antony and Octavian decided to deal. The Triumvirate alliance was reconfirmed, and the east-west power sharing was formalized, with Antony crucially conceding Gaul to Octavian. Lepidus still hung in there in his official triumvir, and was granted the province of Africa, but by now he was irrelevant. The third wheeled triumvir campaign against Sextus Pompey in Sicily, but it will only net him a forced retirement. The treaty was met with relief by the people of Rome, and further celebrated when news came of the final deal sealer. Newly widowed Antony would wed Octavian's sister, Octavia. The triumvirate was one big happy family again. They all returned to Rome together to celebrate the coming nuptials. Meanwhile, Sextus Pompey, who had so recently been courted by both triumvirs, was now out in the political cold again and returned to his blockade. But though he was not going to play the part of kingmaker, his strangulation of the grain supply routes was taking its toll in Rome, and the triumvirs came under immense pressure to come to terms with him. After initially refusing any compromise, the triumvirate finally bowed to the ever-rising grain prices, and in the summer of 39 BC, invited Pompey to the bargaining table. In exchange for lifting the blockade, the triumvirs offered to legalize his hold over Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, making the young man governor of all three islands. In addition, they would slate him for a consulship the next year. After mulling it over, Sextus agreed. By legalizing Sextus, the triumvirs also invited back into the fold all the Republican exiles who had fled to his banner. Proscribed families, lucky to get out of Rome alive, were now allowed to return to their homes. One young family who took the triumvirate up on their offer of clemency was Tiberius Claudius Nero, his 19-year-old wife Livia Drusilla, and their infant son, also named Tiberius. They had been on the run since Tiberius the Elder had joined and then fled from Fulvia's ill-advised revolt 2 years before. Tiberius was something of a doofus who always managed to find himself on the wrong side of any given fight, going back to his stance against the first triumvirate 15 years earlier. His only lasting contribution to Roman history was the fact that he agreed to a divorce when Octavian announced that he intended to marry Livia, having fallen madly in love with her at first sight. The only complication was that both Livia and Scribonia were pregnant. Devoid of sentimentality, Octavian divorced Scribonia on the day she gave birth to his only biological child, a daughter named Julia, in October 39 BC. He and Livia were wed 3 days after she gave birth to her second son, Drusus. With these marital ties lined up, the Julio-Claudian dynasty that we have all come to know and love finally fell into place. The infant Tiberius would, in time, be adopted by Augustus and then inherit the throne, becoming Rome's second emperor. His brother Drusus was the father of Claudius, grandfather of Caligula, and great-grandfather of Nero. Germanicus is in there too, but we'll get to all of that. Almost immediately after securing the treaty with the triumvirate, Sextus realized that he had made a terrible deal. He was already in control of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. There was nothing the triumvirate could have done about that. So he had bargained for control over things he already controlled. In return, he had given up the mantle of last defender of the Republic. The money and support that flooded his way for playing this part suddenly dried up. All his allies had returned home or given up on him. Octavian was no fan of the agreement either, but with the situation in the West finally settled, Antony clamped down on any talk of further aggression against Sextus. He needed things quiet in Rome if he was ever going to get the eternally delayed Parthian campaign off the ground. But by 38 BC, with Antony back in the east planning his war, and Sextus disrupting the grain supply again in an attempt to stay relevant, Octavian decided to ignore his colleagues' wishes and deal with the meddlesome Pompey once and for all. With the defection of one of Sextus's top captains, Octavian decided to strike while the iron was hot. He now knew where young Pompey was and exactly what his defenses were. If he could clear Sextus off the table quickly, Antony would return from the east with Octavian the undisputed ruler of the Western Empire. It was a seductive thought, and so he voided the treaty with Sextus and attacked. Octavian planned a two-pronged assault of Sicily. He ordered a fleet led by Sextus's ex-captain to sail south and attack the north coast of the island. Meanwhile, the triumvir himself would lead another force in from the east. He hoped to quickly pin Sextus down in Messana, just across the straits from mainland Italy. But this initial thrust turned into a complete debacle. The fleet coming south was challenged, defeated, and forced to retreat. Octavian quickly shifted his plans and decided to try to rush through the straits of Messana and link up with the retreating fleet. Two prongs were nice, but if this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought, one great big prong was better than two little prongs. But Octavian was an inexperienced naval commander, and as soon as he set sail, Sextus pounced and drove Octavian's fleet into the rocks. Octavian barely escaped with his life. Most of his fleet was either on fire or dashed on the rocks. In a cruel twist of fate, the next morning, Octavian and the survivors awoke to a sudden storm, and what few ships they had left sunk. Octavian struck while the iron was hot all right, and it burned him badly. Humiliated but undeterred, Octavian called for Agrippa to help plan a new invasion. To give his friend all the resources he needed, Octavian had the 26-year-old appointed consul for the year 37 BC. That whole year was spent building a new fleet. But because Octavian wanted to lull Sextus into a false sense of security, and because any attempt to construct anything in a regular port would likely be harassed by constant attack, Agrippa designed and built canals linking an inland lake to the sea. Then, under the cover of a dense forest, out of sight, he built and trained a massive new navy on the lake. Of more immediate importance to Octavian, on January the 1st, 37 BC, the same day that Agrippa assumed the consulship, the term of the Second Triumvirate officially expired. He and Antony were still in power, obviously, but technically they had no standing within the political system. So a summit was scheduled to work out the details of renewing the pact. Antony returned from the east and his opening skirmishes with the Parthians in the spring, and at Tarentum he and Octavian met and hashed out the terms. It was roughly the same deal as before. Octavian would control the west and Antony the east. This time, rather than sealing the deal with a marriage, a troop exchange was arranged. Octavian needed ships for his war with Sextus, and Antony needed ground legions for his 120 ships for 4 of Octavian's legions. But in a move that would sow the seeds for the demise of the triumvirate, while Antony duly sent the ships, Octavian refused to live up to his end of the bargain and never sent the promised legions. Antony was furious at the betrayal, and it destroyed whatever trust he had left in his partner for good. War between them was now inevitable. It was just a matter of time. Agrippa shepherded the renewal of the triumvirate through the Senate and the assemblies, and having placed his friend back in official power, returned to the fleet that he would lead against Sextus. In the spring of 36 BC, the 300 ships, each bigger than anything Sextus commanded and equipped with the latest in grappling hook technology, sailed out into the Mediterranean. For this latest attempt to conquer Sicily, Octavian now envisioned a three-prong assault. With Agrippa attacking the north coast, he ordered Lepidus to land 10 legions on the southern coast and begin capturing as much territory as possible. With Sextus busy fighting on two fronts, Octavian himself would ferry more ground legions across the straits. Sextus would be overwhelmed. At first things went great. Lepidus landed and began capturing city after city. But when Agrippa attacked from the north, Sextus suspected that it was just a feint meant to distract from whatever Octavian was up to. So he left just enough ships to make a nice show of fighting Agrippa, and led the rest around the Horn into the Straits of Messana. Octavian, thinking he had outsmarted Sextus, had landed with a force to establish a beachhead, and then found himself trapped by the sudden appearance of Sextus's fleet. Braving possible capture, Octavian slipped through the blockade in a small ship to link back up with the rest of his army. It was do or die time now. He had to get the rest of his army into Sicily, or all would be lost. Rumors were already filtering in that Lepidus was talking alliance with Sextus. Octavian needed to fill the island with his own men before any deal was struck. Luckily, though, Sextus was spread thin and only had 300 ships left at his disposal. With so many blockading the straits, he was forced to leave some of the northern ports defenseless. Agrippa was able to easily capture and hold them. Octavian hooked back up with his legions on the mainland and sailed them north to land under the protection of Agrippa's fleet. Pretty soon, the transfer was complete. Totally outnumbered on land, Sextus gathered all of his ships at his stronghold in Messana. The only hope he had left now was to provoke a sea battle. In early September, he led his ships out of the harbor and went looking for Agrippa. The two fleets met off the northeast coast of the island, near the city of Nalochus. On paper, it was an even engagement, east side controlling 300 ships, but Agrippa's fleet was larger and more powerful. It was by no means a one-sided affair, but throughout the whole day's fighting, Sextus lost ships at a slightly faster rate. By the end of the day, the Pompeian captains determined that the cause was lost and began to surrender to Agrippa rather than keep fighting. With his navy captured, it was all over for Sextus. He took the 17 ships that remained uncaptured and sailed east. Over the course of the next year, he tried to find asylum and allies, but was rebuked at every turn. Unwilling to surrender, he was eventually captured in Anatolia and executed by a provincial governor loyal to the triumvirate. After Agrippa's victory at Nalochus, Octavian now stood alone in the west. There was no one left to challenge his rule. Well, almost no one. Lepidus, who had conquered most of Sicily during the invasion, suddenly decided to reassert himself in the triumvirate. He claimed by right of conquest Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and demanded that Octavian recognize his claim. Octavian scoffed at this notion. He had not gone through all this trouble to take Sicily just to give it away to a rival. He sent men into the ranks of Lepidus's legions to sow dissent. Lepidus, who was never very popular with the average grunt, watched in horror as his legions began to desert from his banner en masse. Without any leverage left, Lepidus met with Octavian and rescinded his claim. Octavian, seizing an opportunity to eliminate Lepidus from the balance of power, decided to unilaterally expel him from the triumvirate as punishment. From now on, though the name never caught on, it truly was a biumvirate. Lepidus retired to a plush estate on the Italian coast and lived another 20 years in comfortable obscurity. Next week, we'll head east to trace the ups and downs of Antony's campaigns against the Parthians. But as I said before, it was more downs than ups. The apex of Antony's career was the Battle of Philippi. Everything after that was just a slow descent into ruin. Completely in control of the West now, Octavian would use every tool at his disposal to turn public opinion against his colleague, particularly harping on the fact that Antony seemed to be going native, dressing